Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks for doing it. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, everybody, for joining this webinar. This third Mix with the Masters webinar we're doing currently, and we're trying to do one every day. And today we're here with the great Andy Wallace. So, Andy, thank you so much for doing this.
Okay, well, my pleasure. I'm glad to be doing it, and I hope I can shed some light on everybody's questions here, as many as I can. But it's a pleasure. I'm glad to be sharing information. Okay, so I guess we are officially rolling here. So I will just start addressing these questions. Let me see. The first one here is, oh, there I am. Okay. The first one is, when mixing, what are you looking for as far as ideal levels out of Pro Tools into your SSL console? Ballpark VU level showing on the desk for kick and snare, bass, mix levels on the master VU, mix bus comp. Okay. What I like to see coming out of Pro Tools is I looked at the levels marking the input to each channel, and if they're very low, I will often boost the volume coming out of Pro Tools so that I have a good level on a VU meter. Obviously, if it's too hot and possibly overloading a preamp, which would be evident, first of all, by hearing it, but also I can get a sense of that by looking at the meter. If the meter is completely skied out, I'll drop it down. So basically, I want to see a full meter level on the console. Now, sometimes when I would change that and lower the level considerably coming from Pro Tools is if the way the fader is being used in the mix, if I'm not up at a higher level on the physical fader on the SSL board, if I'm working where it's reading -30 or -40 decibels, it's really hard to do fine tuning of a couple dB just because of the fader. So I will lower the level coming out of Pro Tools into the board so that I can actually run my fader, and I'm just talking about the individual channel fader, so I can run that up in a level in the neighborhood of 0, so I have the best opportunity to fine tune levels. As far as ballpark view showing on the desk, I'm not sure if you're talking on this one about just the fader levels or my stereo level. Again, I try to use the VU levels on the console to give me a general idea of where I'm at on that. So hopefully that answered that question. I want to thank everybody that in these comments have thanked me for doing this. It's nice to hear, and I'm glad to do it. I'm sorry if I'm not always looking at the camera. I'm busy looking at the questions, but I'll try to look at the camera as well. All right. Okay. Here's an interesting question. What project did you find most challenging / difficult during your career? Why? What were the challenges and difficulties to overcome? I don't know if I could name any one particular project, especially that my career is kind of double-pronged in the sense that I've done a lot of production and I've done a lot of mixing of records that were not my production. So they're a little bit different challenges. Rather than saying any one particular project, singling it out as a difficult project, I can talk just about some of the difficulties that I have had to deal with and overcome. The coronavirus is probably one of the most challenging so far. It's the first time in my career that I've canceled a session. I was mixing in Miami a couple of weeks ago, and after a week into the album mix, I decided to delay the project until things get a little bit better. But really, one of the things that I try to do in mixing I can talk about production later, I guess, but I think mainly we're addressing mixing here. One of the things that I try to do is I don't believe there's any one mix that's the only one and only perfect mix to a project. I think a lot depends on what the band and the band's management and the whole team of people that are working with and for the band, where they want to go with the mix, but especially the band and the producer. It's their record. It's not really my record. It's their record. And so I feel that what I'm supposed to be bringing to the table is to assemble a mix that is flexible enough so it can be a little weighted guitar heavy, or the drums can be drier or ambient, more ambient, depending on their request and their vision for what this record should be. I will certainly provide information and suggestions, and also I'm very typically hired because somebody likes the way my records sound anyway. So there's usually not too much of a battle there. They're looking for what I do. And but getting back to what I was saying, I really feel that the important thing for me to do is to have a mix that will hold up and be successful in. I'm saying the picture's distracting me a little bit. That will hold up depending on how they want to move it. If somebody wants it more guitar heavy, or they want, as I say, more ambience on the drums or something, hopefully the mix that I've set up for them to listen to can be bent or twisted those ways and still work well. So that's my goal. But what I'm getting to here is it's gotten more challenging now that we're listening to approval and getting feedback from the artist about where the mix is at. In other words, I'll set it up to the point where I feel it's sounding pretty good, and have them listen to it. Used to be they were in the studio and you play it for them right there, and they'd hear it instantly, and then you discuss, the hi-hat should be this or that and the other thing. Now it's a matter of sending it out more often than not. It's more common now to not have the artist in the studio, which has there's good things about it and bad things about it. The good thing is they can be continuing with their career if they're in the middle of rehearsing or even in the middle of a tour. The bad thing is you can't always get feedback instantly, and then sometimes whoever is involved with giving me the feedback, it may be more than one person, it may be the producer and a number of people in the band. It gets to be a little more difficult if they're not in the same room together to get their feedback coordinated. So you'll hear back from one person who says, the lead guitar should be louder, and you'll get feedback from another person saying, the lead guitar is too loud, it has to be quieter. And so obviously you can't do both. So getting that feedback coordinated, usually I try to get it coordinated through one individual, whoever is generally the most musically involved from a production point of view, whether that's the producer or the band. It's usually somebody in the band. Try to get them to coordinate everybody else's input, and then send me or somehow supply me with a list of kind of a hit list of things that they'd like to address, so that if there are differences between their own opinions, that they'll get those ironed out ahead of time. But it all takes time. And in the meantime, I work on the SSL console, not just in Pro Tools, so I don't have the ability to just move on to another mix and start working on that. And then when I hear back from them, hit a button and call that mix back. It's more of a complicated process on the board. So I end up having to wait to get feedback a lot of times. Now, generally, there's still a lot of things that are not necessarily things that they need to approve that I can deal with to effectively use the time. But it has made it more difficult. Most often, the people involved try to stay on top of getting back to me as quickly as possible, but it's not always possible, especially if you're dealing with anywhere from a 3 to 5 hour time change. It gets to be more difficult. So that's probably the most difficult thing outside of the coronavirus. Okay, I think I talked enough about that. I should move on. Uh, well, there's a question here about could you please list off some common EQ moves when dealing with drums? Say snare removing 500 at uh, at 100, and a little lift at 1K, kick, little bump on resonant fundamental, etc. Well, I don't necessarily have any one particular thing that I always do to drums because they vary quite a bit depending on how the recordings come in. I do find that I often will add kind of either a broad curve, high end, or even a shelf on kick and snare. Not always necessarily to get that super metallic kick drum sound, but just to give it some presence. As far as low end, depending on what else is going on in the track, with, let's say, guitars and bass, but keyboards as well, there may be some lower mids that I may want to actually take out of a kick drum, for instance, just to not create too much of a density in that frequency range. And I often will find myself actually boosting in the neighborhood of 100, 150 cycles to get a little bit more warmth on the bottom. But again, all of this really can vary does vary depending on the recording that comes in. I also will usually spend a little bit of time applying some compression to, and I do this to both the kick and the snare. I typically will just use the SSL compressor right in line in the channel, and compress that some. Usually, I'm guessing maybe 4 or 5 dB of compression, and usually a fairly high ratio. But again, it's all guided by listening to it. I don't have any specific setting that this is what I always use. It's really driven by listening, as is just about everything I do. I don't always do things conventionally. I never went to school for any of this. But anyway, I do find that compression, adding a little of that compression on the kick and snare, can often make it pop a little bit more and give it a little more punch. And of course, I'm doing this in mixes where you want it to be punchy, as opposed to a very quiet, sedate mix. So I'm generally speaking more in things where you want it to punch, and where it's a rockier mix, whether it be a metal or rock mix or whatever. Cymbals, I often clear out a lot of low end and mids out of cymbals. Again, it depends on how it sounds to me, based on what else is going on in the song, such as guitars and other percussion instruments, perhaps. But I find a lot of times there's a lot of low frequency information, which, when you just listen to the cymbal alone, it sounds fine. It could be a nice rich tone. But given the part that particular cymbal plays in the mix, and especially a cymbal that is being ridden, where it's very, very present all the time, at least while it's being played, I find that there are mids and lows that really they're not adding anything to my ears. They're not adding anything musical to the mix. And what they're doing, although you may not see it, it's again, crowding certain frequency ranges where you may not notice that it's obstructing it, but over a number of instruments that are working together in that range, it creates a cloudier, less definition. I'm always trying to look for definition. And sometimes an example of that, we're getting away from drums, but a piano sometimes, depending on how that piano functions in the arrangement, I may radically EQ it to the point where you'd listen to it alone and think, oh, why did he make it sound like that? It sounded great when it was just full range. But again, it's for that same reason. If there's something where it's really only providing a really important high-end aspect to that arrangement, and yet there's all this low end going on the piano, it may not be necessary for it to be in there, especially if it's not a featured instrument way up front. So these things all come into play, and you have to adjust. But other than that, I don't have any magic formula for drums as far as EQing live mics on drums. Let me move on to another mix here. Another question. Here's an interesting one. Could you explain to us, how do you recognize that the mix is done? Any advice to learn when the balance is good? Well, I usually spend, just to give you a little background on this, I generally mix very quickly in the early part of the mix, kind of getting, again, if I'm addressing this as a band track, a rock track, I usually move fairly quickly at the beginning, getting balances between the primary instruments in whatever track it is. So if it's one or two or more guitars, typically bass and drums, maybe percussion in there, and I'll usually start working with all those things. I'll listen to them individually to just get a sense of what's there, but I'll work with them in conjunction to get a band track that feels nice and punchy. I also, at some point, I'll talk about stereo bus compression on the entire mix, but I usually put that on fairly early when I'm getting this band track to sound punchy and powerful. But during this time, I mix fairly quickly. I move fairly quickly. I always liken it to riding a bike, where if you ride too slowly, you have to get wobbly and get off track. So I try to move quickly without getting too hung up on things, and I'll make sometimes fairly, I don't know, bold is the word, but extreme EQ. I won't worry too much about exactly fine-tuning the EQ at that point. And as I proceed, obviously, I will fine-tune it to a greater extent. But the point I'm trying to make is the early part of the mix, I'll mix fairly quickly. And then I'll start working with individual things, solo instruments, vocals, background vocals, lead vocals, any other arrangements, if there's strings or horns in the music. I'll start adding all that in and adjusting the basic tracks that I had worked on as I go. And so I keep this process of fine-tuning, not fine-tuning, of adding everything in until I have everything in. And that also helps me kind of learn the roadmap through the track. I get familiar with where these vocals are doing this, or when this particular part comes in. And so I'll just keep listening down repeatedly, and without any particular order, start going, oh, well, I'll make an adjustment on the kick drum, or I'll suddenly, oh wait, that background vocal, wait a minute, I'm going to pan that further to the right or something. No particular order, just things as I hear them, I'll go attend to them. So I do that for a while. It starts to get a little bit slower process because I spend a lot of that time just listening back and trying to be objective. I find it's a difficult thing, but it's very valuable to, after you're so subjectively involved within the mix, paying so much attention to this and so much attention to that, to sit back occasionally and listen just as if you were a fan of the band and you were listening to their new album. And listen to the mix that way without really so much being inside of it like that. And it's hard to do that sometimes, to step back and do that. But I think it's an important skill to develop, because that you do hear it differently when you hear it objectively like that. So I'll spend a lot of time doing that, and that's when the mix tends to get slower. But in any event, I'll have it finally to the point where I feel I could play it for somebody, and they could I could well expect, although I don't usually get it, but I could expect a response of, wow, that's about done, maybe one or two small changes, and then we're ready to print it. I try to get it so that it's in that neighborhood. There may be some individual things that I know I want to tweak and clean up that don't really have to do with them making assessments of how the mix sounds, but they're just little mechanical things I may need to get rid of a click here or there or something like that. I'll save some of those things to do while I'm waiting for them to get back to me upon listening to the pass one or whatever I call it that I send them. But in any event, invariably the first pass comes back with a list of various things that the band members or whoever is in charge of this would like to hear different. And hopefully it's not too extreme. It usually isn't, but there's usually certain things that need to be tended to. And it varies, but the mix is really done when they say it's done. Usually at that point, after the first pass or two that I've sent out and gotten information back, I'm of the mind that if they should tell me it's done, then it's done. I'm satisfied with it. There may still be one or two little things that I hear that I want to straighten out that are not anything substantial in terms of their feedback. But the point is, as far as I'm concerned, after that first pass or two that I send out for approval, I'm happy with the mix as it is. I'm certainly happy to change it and fine tune it according to desires. But for me, as far as the mix being done, at that point, I can say it's done for me. So then it's really up to them and presumably up to my ability to make changes along the lines that they're asking for, and still having the mix stay together, keep that glue together, and not get too far afield. Now, there are times when I have to say, what they're asking is really going to substantially change the mix, and be sure you know what you're asking for, so to speak, because at that point we've all pretty much agreed that things sound really good. Let's not rock the boat too much. So, and then sometimes you have to get into being a little part psychologist, but fortunately that isn't usually a big issue. Generally, it's a very open, good communication. And I have to say that a lot of times that fine tuning, even though I may have thought, hey, if you think the mix is done, I'm happy with it, let's print it. Some of their continued finer tuning suggestions are beneficial to the mix. And I'll have to say, I see it. That's why it's important for me to get the artist's point of view, because they hear it in a different way than I do. And they as I said, I feel my job is to be able to adjust my mixes without destroying it and still incorporate their things. So I hope that answers when the mix is done. And then, of course, the other thing is if the budget is so completely blown out of proportion that the mix has to be done, there's that to watch out for. But that's usually, you can usually see that coming well ahead of time and make adjustments. Okay, let me look at more questions here. Oh, okay. Can you please talk a bit about the mix bus compression that you like to use and whether it varies from song to song? I was always a big fan of the quad compressor coming out of the G series SSL consoles. The J's and K's are not bad, but I didn't quite, they didn't quite hit me the same way. So lately I've been generally mixing. I still occasionally mix on a G console, but generally speaking, I'm mixing on a J or K. And I've been using the smart compressor, the C2. I do vary settings a little bit on it, but for the rock things, I found that I usually start with a 4-to-1 ratio, and I'll use the auto release on it. And I guess a very fast attack, like a millisecond, or maybe it's a tenth of a millisecond. Anyway, a very fast attack. As I said, I start running the mix through it fairly early on. I also make sure that it's inserted in my mix chain before the master fader, so that when I do a fader ride, for instance, a fade out at the end of a song, that it won't alter how it's hitting the compressor. So there's an insert point pre-master fader where I will apply the compression, and then I will adjust the compressor has a threshold and an output, so I'll adjust those accordingly. I try not to have the output up too much on the smart compressor, just to avoid noise. I'd rather adjust my input to it to get and the threshold adjustment to get what I want there. The amount to which I compress on a rock track, the actual gain reduction, I would guess around 4 dB is kind of average. I sometimes will use less if I don't want it to pump quite so hard. I've been known on some tracks to go considerably more than 4 dB, but I would say that's kind of a safe starting point for me. So that's my story on compression. One other quick thing about how to use that and how to hit it, how to get the level to hit it. When I set up my grouping on the SSL, I usually only group to the first 7 group faders, and then I will often assign those 7 group faders to fader number 8, and that way I can actually adjust the entire output of my mix at the console before the compressor and keep it all intact just with one fader, rather than trying to move them all down and hope they're going down the same amount. So I don't always do that, but it's a little way. It's a way that I found that makes it easy to adjust how hard I hit the compressor without having to raise the output gain on it. Okay, let me look at another question here. Oh, there's one here. There are very aggressive effects on some of your mixes, like the distorted outro on Breed Apart by Sepultura. Do you come up with such ideas yourself? Or is this producer's or artist's decision? Well, a little of both, but I will, again, I try to follow their lead on that. But if I have an idea for something that I think would be an interesting thing, even though it may be a little out of the ordinary and not necessarily what was indicated by the tracks that I was presented with, I won't spend hours and hours and hours on something like that before making sure that that's something that they're interested in, and I don't get offended if they say, well, that's very interesting, but no, we don't want it. But I do feel if I have an idea like for that or anything. I honestly, in that particular instance, don't recall whether whose idea that was. But in any event, I guess I'm not really giving much information on this answer. But it could be anybody's decision. But I do enjoy doing things a little out of the ordinary sometimes. Not just so I can exercise my brain cells, but just to provide a little more excitement or interest into a piece of music. And sometimes people like it, sometimes people don't. Sometimes they'll request something and I'll set it up and they'll decide, nah, after listening to it, we're going to pass on it. So it could be any combination of that. Well, he says, to put it differently, when approaching a mixed project, do you try to preserve what is on the multitrack, or are you not afraid to reinvent the song if you feel it needs it? Well, if I feel it really needs serious reinvention, that's something I would certainly discuss with the band and the producer before I spent any time on it. But as far as I do try to respect what I get from the multi-track. I try to use that as much as possible. As an example, I do everything I can to utilize the mic'd drums, the kick. One second, I gotta. Pardon me. I try to do everything I can to get the most out of the mic'd kick and the mics on the snare, and all the drums for that matter. As many of you probably do know, I do often use I call it an ambient sample that I will not replace the bass drum and the snare drum with, but I'll have it triggered along with it. These days, I don't really trigger it anymore. I used to use a trigger and a sampler, but now I just have the sample laid into Pro Tools. But I use that not to replace the drum sound, but to basically generate reverbs, whether it's a short, medium, or long reverb. And I find that way I can really EQ the reverb. I'll use that ambient sample and sometimes radically EQ that, much more radically than I would the actual mic from the snare. Again, I don't have any set EQ to use for that. It depends on what the track sounds like, but I will sometimes EQ radically and sweep through frequencies, and sometimes use a narrow bandwidth to kind of see, as it goes into the reverb, to see what excites, a nice reverb sound that I feel fits into the whole equalization of the entire track. So it gives me a chance to basically to fine tune my reverb on the kick and snare and the ambient sound. It also allows me to not have to necessarily rely just on ambient mics in the room for some of my ambience. It gives me a little more control. I will rarely, again, totally replace an ambient mic on the drum set, but again, I can augment it, and it gives me a lot of control over the EQ, basically, of the reverb. I don't necessarily usually do a lot of EQ on the reverb returns themselves, because I'm often sharing those reverbs. I'm sending various different signals into that reverb, and what an EQ that works well for one might not work well for the other. So instead, I EQ the ambient sample. But again, I bend over backwards not to necessarily replace the drum sounds. Now, more and more people are sending recordings in that have extra drum samples on there, and I will use them. I don't always use all of them, but I certainly explore them and see, they're there for a reason. So they must have heard something that they thought would be good at some point in the course of production to use those additional samples. So I'll explore them and see how they work, and see what makes me smile upon hearing it. Okay, but I generally try to utilize what's on the multi-track as much as possible. There are certain tones that definitely I can hear right away. I'm going to need to trim some frequencies off this certain guitar or something, or this piano, for instance, will definitely need to be brighter to cut through the rest of the track. So I'm not shy about drastic EQ. Whatever works, you can always back it off. So I'm not shy about trying drastic EQ. Okay, I'm gonna move on here. Gotta watch my time. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting one. Does Linkin Park or other bands send their live acoustic drums quantized? If so, do they also quantize the room tracks? Yes, I can't swear that all Linkin Park tracks are quantized, but just speaking in general of bands that I get in, particularly some of the more driving metal band tracks, they are often quantized. And I believe they've quantized the overheads as well. You almost have to, otherwise you're going to have some very sloppy ambient sound. A quick word, which actually reflects back a little bit more to my altering tracks that come from the multi tracks. I will sometimes, for instance, if there's a ride cymbal that is fairly buried in the overheads, and but we'll have a maybe following a crash, the first couple rides after the crash, the band will want to hear the ride cymbal louder. And if I just bring the ride cymbal track up, then the crash will come up louder than I want it to be. And so sometimes there's a problem with that, especially if the crash doesn't sound the way I want it to sound on the bleed of the ride cymbal track. So I have, and again, I'm not shy about doing this. I will sometimes grab a few hits of the ride cymbal, for instance, and actually move that onto up front where the crash is on the ride cymbal track. I don't know if I'm making this clear, but I'll take the first few hits of that ride cymbal that in the original recording were masked by the crash cymbal, and I wasn't able to bring them up the way I wanted to. I will take some that are from a place where there is no ride cymbal, or just a very later decay of that ride cymbal, and pop those in and play around with that so I can get the level of the ride right up without having to crash all over it. So I'll do things like that. Again, I'm not shy about grabbing things like that. Or certainly if I hear something that's out of time, whether it be maybe the drums are quantized, but some other instrument comes down on a downbeat and is too early, or a percussion thing. If it feels sloppy to me, I don't get crazy about automatically quantizing everything. But if I hear something, I got into this whole thing as a musician. I have a musician's ear for sure. And if I hear something that just feels wrong to me, and I feel, it could be made so much stronger if we pop that in, I have no qualms at all about adjusting that and bringing that in time. And the same thing with tuning. I don't go crazy. I don't automatically consider it my job to tune somebody's vocal, but or a guitar or anything. But if I hear something that it just feels very wrong to me, and I know without violating the style and sound of the for instance, the singer's voice, I'll fix it. If it's something fairly radical or approaching semi-radical, I'll call that to their attention so that they don't later hear something and say like, wait a minute, I loved it the way it was, So I will call it to their attention, and very rarely have I had somebody say, oh, no, put it back. Usually it's like, oh, great, thank you, So again, I have no qualms about doing things like that. But I don't feel I have to, do it to leave my imprint on it. This is an Andy Wallace mix, and boy, those vocals are going to be just dead on. I don't do that. I don't think that's real sounding even. And even with drums sometimes, it's good to let them breathe a little bit, especially if they were presented to you that way. I don't feel it's my job to quantize them. Okay. Okay. Can you give us beginners 3 tips that you would also suggest to yourself if you were starting out now? So it's sort of like, if I only knew then what I know now. I would let me think of 3 good tips for that, because I think it's a good question. I would say don't be shy on EQ. I would also say don't be in a hurry to start adding reverbs. Even in my own mixes, I keep them pretty dry at the beginning, because that's where I want to get that punch. I don't want to get confused by reverbs. Even when I spoke about the ambient samples on the drums, I'll either not use them or keep them very low. But I want to see how much I can get the track to really punch and rock, given what was on the actual recordings. So I would be I'd be shy about using reverbs until later. So start your mix out, I would, keeping it fairly dry. Try to get that punch going on. Don't be shy about EQ. Don't be negligent about it. Don't be careless about it, rather. But listen for those frequencies. And again, some of you may have heard this, but I liken it to taking a group photograph where you want to get everybody's face in the picture. Sometimes you have to move people a little left or have them, stoop down a little bit or sit down, or put the taller person in the back. You do things like that. So for me, that's an analogy to how I set up a mix. So I try to get everything so you can hear it. I want to know that my mixes will have definition and clarity, even though then they can still be distorted and gritty and nasty sounding or whatever. But you can still have what I consider in the true sense high fidelity, where you really can hear things, you hear definition. And I want to know that it's going to sound good on a lot of different kinds of speakers, big speakers in a club. I want to know it's going to sound good on a blaster kicked over in the sand. So those are, I don't know if that's 3 tips or 2 tips, but those are a couple of things I would definitely say. And then the other thing is to try to learn that trick to sit back occasionally and listen more objectively. Don't always just stay on, fix this, we're going to adjust this, we're going to do this. Just sometimes listen back, get a cup of coffee or something, and sit back and don't worry about the mix. Just listen to it. And you may even want to listen down several times right in a row without touching a thing, and then all of a sudden you say, every time it gets to that second chorus, I hear this one thing pop out too much, and when you were looking at it through a microscope, you wouldn't see that necessarily. So that thing to be objective like that. And then I guess I could add a fourth thing is I really believe in the philosophy of there is no perfect mix. So don't be afraid to say it's done, it's ready to go. Okay, I'm gonna move on. All right. Here's one. This will be kind of difficult to answer, but I think it's worth addressing. Any tips for heavy guitar EQ and compression? What are the usual suspects frequency-wise? I often struggle to balance heavy guitars so they don't feel apart from the rest, yet not buried. I can't speak for anybody else, but I don't usually compress heavy guitars. They're usually pretty well compressed by their distortion already. Now, sometimes in the case of a guitar figure, there may be certain frequencies that are going to pop out during a lick, and certain note will be much louder than other ones. I sometimes will compress that, but also a lot of times I'll actually, I used to do it just riding the faders. I spent a lot of time riding faders. Now I do a lot of that really individual note riding in Pro Tools. It's faster and just as effective. But getting back to the overall compression, I don't use a lot of compression on the guitars. As far as EQ, what are the usual suspects? A lot of times the guitars are either they're shrill in a super high end frequency, and not so I'll work. A lot of times I'll work with upper mids on guitars where you're getting into the high range a little bit, but there's still a lot of note meat on the bones as far as notes. So I'll do that sometimes to get note clarity, so you can really hear, for instance, what chord is being played, as opposed to hearing mostly the grit. I will occasionally knock off some extremely high end that I feel is not really necessarily adding anything, and perhaps is going to actually allow me to bring the guitars up a little louder before they start eating up all the cymbals or the shakers or whatever, or the vocals. Low end is and low mids are definitely areas that I adjust. Depending on how they work with the bass, sometimes I will actually increase some low end on the guitars so that it actually forms almost kind of one instrument with the low end of the bass, which I know that sounds like the opposite of what I'm trying to do about getting separation and clarity. But sometimes that's a good thing to do to get the guitars and bass. Again, it depends on the figures they're playing, but to get them to really work together. And you don't necessarily need to hear exactly which instrument the low end is coming from, the bass or the guitars. So that sometimes on a rock track is something I'll do. And lower mids, mid-range, I'll use the same as I said before. Sometimes I'll adjust that to either lower it to make room for something else that is more important than note value, that is more important than what that rhythm guitar is doing. Or I'll do just the opposite. I'll actually boost it a little bit because I want to hear, at that point, maybe the rhythm guitar, or if there's two of them, like a stereo pair, maybe that's the really important thing. If they're chugging or something, maybe that's the really important musical thing to hear. So I want to make sure you can really hear the note of that as well as the grit. So those are some of the things that I look at when I'm dealing with those guitars to try to get them so that they work with everything else. Okay. Get another call coming through there. All right. Here's one. It says SPX 90 presets, only symphonic and lexicon presets. Typically, the SPX 90 has become my go-to chorus. It's a little noisy. I will sometimes gate it. I almost always will cut it out when it's not in use, particularly on the end of a song, when I'm fading or letting it something sustain, because they are kind of noisy. But they have other models now that are quieter, and when they're in the studio, I'll generally use them. So it's not oh, it's got to be an SPX 90 or nothing. I'll use that, or I'll even use a different chorus effect. I usually have that set up as just an effect that I can send to off one of the sends, one of the effect sends on the board. I'll use it for a number of different things. Occasionally I'll use it so you can really hear it. You can really hear what it's doing, but a lot of times I'll use it just to shade something a little bit, or to give something a little bit of a stereo expansion. On the bass, for instance, I won't necessarily want you to notice that there's any chorus effect on the bass, but for me, it'll give it a little more body in the width of the mix. And I'll use it on just about anything that I feel it can be used on. There's no rules, no hard and fast rules. Again, experimenting is always kind of important. So, I like the lexicon units. I use I'm partial to the the small room. There's a number of them of small room, tile room, and this type of thing on the lexicons. I use the 480 generally for my longer reverbs. Usually a mid-length reverb. I usually have three reverb set up: a small, roomish sounding reverb, medium, what I'd call a medium-length reverb, and then a longer reverb. And I have these, and then usually the chorus unit. Those are often my four effect sends that I have set up, just readily available at the board. I use others for sure, but those are the go-to ones. As far as what settings on those, that can really vary depending on the song, particularly the length of the reverbs I'm talking about. Okay. How do you approach panning in multiple tracks of guitars or other instruments? I'm a big fan of left and right rhythm guitars, hard left and right rhythm guitars. I don't always do that, but it's certainly something that I feel gives the mix a nice big fat sound and clears a little room out of the center. So I don't know if that fully answers the question there. I'll often try to put a lead guitar or something slightly off center, maybe to balance something that's slightly off the other side of the spectrum. And I just find the more stereo interest I can get, the better. I will occasionally have things panning across. I don't want to get too gimmicky, particularly if it's a song that shouldn't be gimmicky. But anything I can do to kind of get the stereo image as broad and interesting as possible, I'll certainly experiment with it. And that being said, it's not that typical for me to take a lead vocal, for instance, and put it off to one side, unless it's an answer type thing. But I will background vocals and such. I'll move them around, but I try to get things fairly wide. Okay, I've got time for a few more questions. I'm sorry I can't get to everybody's question. There's a zillion questions. I'm just trying to go down and pick the ones that I think I have something most useful to say about it. Oh, here's an interesting one. How does your workday look like? Well, I would say if you're planning to make a career out of particularly mixing, to some degree production as well, but particularly mixing, again, I can't speak for anybody else, but a typical workday for me is anywhere from 12 to 16 hours. It's rarely less than 12 hours. So I guess I've been blessed with an ability to stay conscious and hopefully focused for long periods of time. But I tend to get, I don't know if I describe it as manic exactly, but I get really focused on it and intensely involved with the process. And so I do work long days. So that typically I try to get into the studio around 10 in the morning. And if I'm out by midnight, that's a pretty reasonable day for me, but they do go longer. I don't do all-nighters anymore, though. I've had in the past, back in the 80s, where I would work 30 hours straight, but I don't do that anymore. Those days are over for me. All right, let me see. Well, there's one here. How much prep and cleaning do you and your assistants do before starting the mix? Do you edit guitars and drums to make them cleaner, tighter? I don't. Before beginning the mix, I'm not even sure, necessarily whether the drums and guitars need tightening or cleaning. Those are things I'll find out more when I'm working in the mix. But some of the things I do before I begin the mix is I pay some attention to laying things out on the console the way I want. Especially if it's an assistant engineer that I haven't worked with before. And then these days, as I said, my ambient samples, which I don't always use, but I usually have them set up and available. I'll instead of triggering them from a delay line now, I'll have the assistant engineer. I work with a Pro Tools engineer. I mean, I know Pro Tools. I certainly know editing. But I am not the fastest Pro Tools guy in the world by far. So I'd much rather work with an assistant who hopefully has a good musical sense and I can relate to quickly, but who can do operations on Pro Tools a lot faster. And also who's got some knowledge that I don't have about different plugins and such. So anyway, I'll have the assistant lay in the ambient samples before we start. Okay, we'll probably have time for a little bit more here. Whoops. Well, here's one. Do you generally use a one-shot snare sample or a dynamic one? As I said, I don't generally use snare samples of a live sample recording unless it's provided by the producer and band. As far as my ambient samples, when I used to just trigger them from a delay line, they would come in at the same level, but that doesn't mean I didn't ride it. I certainly do ride them. Now, generally, when we lay them into the Pro Tools, it's done dynamically by a program that as the snare gets louder, the sample will be a little bit louder. I've sometimes decided to defeat that for one reason or another, but I still do a lot of riding on the board. And sometimes, as I said before, actually in Pro Tools. But for instance, with the samples, I'll typically ride that on the board for possibly different sections of songs where a certain level of my ambient sample worked well in one section, but in this other section it's too loud, and I'll bring it down or whatever. Okay. Here's one. Do you prefer compression or automation? Do you find this gives you more of a natural sound? All right. I generally use compression to establish a sound as opposed to controlling the level. So if it's a matter of level, like I said before, sometimes maybe on a guitar part or something, there'll be one note that sticks out and is much louder than the rest. For whatever reason, I generally won't compress. I have done it, but I prefer to ride it, especially since riding is note for note is so much easier now in Pro Tools. But even then, back in the day before, when I was just dealing with analog tape, I did a lot of fader riding. I remember the first time I worked on an automated console, I thought I died and went to heaven. Prior to that, I'd have members of the band and assistant engineers all at the ready on a certain fader, and on this cue you have to bring this note up, and so it made it kind of like a basketball game or something, getting a mix done, and then we print it up to a point where we lost it, back it up, pick it up from there, and then edit it all back together later. So I'm a big fan of automation and adjusting in Pro Tools as opposed to compressing just to keep levels under control. Again, with lead vocals, I will sometimes compress it a little bit, but more often than not, I'll ride most of what I'm doing there. Okay. Overheads. Are you generally wide panning? Yes, but not always hard left and right. Again, it depends on whether the overheads are more of an ambient room or whether they're close mic in the cymbals. In my production, when I record, I generally I do use ambient overheads, but I try to really get cymbals on each mic fairly close in. And to that end, of course, you have to be careful the cymbal doesn't wobble and go give you a swishy sound. I find a lot of times if I mic on axis, I can get in close and still not have that swishy sound. But getting back to it, so if it's close mic like that, I rarely will have them left and right because it doesn't sound natural to have the cymbals crashes so far apart. So I'll bring those in. But ambient samples, I will not ambient samples, ambient room mics. Typically, I would if they're a good stereo pair, I'll have those fairly hard, if not completely hard, left and right. Okay, I might have time for one more here.
Yeah, one more question, if that's all right.
Okay. This is interesting. Are you ever using saturation from the console to control dynamics or achieve sound? Not typically, but because I'm usually not a big fan of the distortion that I get from the console. But there have been occasions where I have done that. But I'm more apt to use some kind of outboard gear, or more recently something in Pro Tools that my trusty Pro Tools engineer may have provided when I asked for something that will give me a distortion. So I guess that's it. And I want to thank everybody for listening to me go on for an hour here. I'm really sorry that I couldn't get to everybody's question. As I said, I tried to stick to the ones that I felt I had something significant to say about. Hopefully significant. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I think we are done. So
Yes.
everybody, good luck with all your mixing.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was amazing. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
So am I done here?
Yes, that's it.
You don't need me anymore.
Yes, thank you. It was very cool.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. And
Thank you.
we'll stay in touch.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.